Okay, so gong farmer. Say it out loud with me. Gong farmer. It sounds like a cottagecore game or class, right? Like some peaceful guy who tends literal gongs in a temple courtyard, incense, soft lighting, the works. It's not that. See, a gong farmer was the person whose entire job every single night was climbing down into a cesspit and shoveling out human waste by hand so the town above didn't drown in its own filth. Gong was old slang for what was down there. You can fill out the rest. Pretty sure you can. And here's where my brain actually stalled out. Like, they only do this at night. Not for privacy, not tradition, smell. Like, if a gong farmer climbed out at noon reeking the way that they reek, it would shut down the whole street. Every shop, every meal, every conversation within 100 feet. So, this job existed in a permanent, mandatory midnight. Same town as everyone else, same cobblestones he walks, but a completely different relationship to daylight. Like, he was running on a separate clock than the rest of the city silently agreed on. And pretended didn't exist. I keep picturing him walking home right as the bakers are walking in to start their ovens. 2 completely different days, crossing paths for 1 second on the same street, and neither of them are really looking at each other. And that's already a story, and I haven't even gotten to the worst part yet. The worst part is that they were paid well, like surprisingly well for the period, because no one else would do it. And a city straight up cannot function without someone doing it. So you've got a guy who's simultaneously one of the better paid tradesmen in the town and also someone people wouldn't sit next to at a meal. Necessary and unwanted in the exact same breath. That tension, being indispensable and being avoided, that's not a medieval problem. That's a character problem. That's every story about the guy who fixes the thing nobody wants to look at directly. You could write someone who is good at this work, genuinely skilled, methodical, takes pride in it, and the story isn't, ew, gross job. The story is what happens to a person's sense of self when the entire town needs him and can't stand him. Does he start preferring the night? Does the silence become the only honest part of his day? Does he have a kid who's embarrassed of him? Or worse, maybe more interesting, a kid who isn't, who actually thinks what he does is heroic and has to slowly learn that nobody else sees it that way. And then there's the smell itself as a plot device, which sounds insane to type and say, but stay with me. Gong farmers, because of the work, would sometimes get carbon monoxide poisoning or just straight up die down in those pits. There are records of farmers dying on the job, trapped in a hole nobody would check on because nobody wanted to be near enough to even rescue someone. Imagine being the one person whose job makes you invisible enough that if something goes wrong at 2 a.m., it might be morning before anyone notices you didn't come home. That's horror. That's a ghost story sitting right there, fully assembled, just waiting for someone to write it. And the thing that keeps nagging at me, every single one of these weird jobs exists because a city got big enough that the old way of dealing with the problem just stopped working. Like, a village doesn't need a gong farmer. A village just walks out back. You only need a gong farmer once there's enough people packed close enough together that out back is somebody else's front door. The job is basically a fossil that tells you the town crossed some invisible population line. If you found gong farmers in the historical record of a place, you honestly didn't need the census data. You already knew the place was crowded. The profession is the proof. Same exact logic, but a completely different smell. Tanners, leather workers, and I want to be honest with you. This one got under my skin more than the cesspit guy, because at least the gong farmer's mess is biological and obvious, right? Like, tanning is a whole industry built around something I genuinely didn't expect in my research. Dung and urine, used on purpose as processing agents. Ew. To soften and cure animal hides. They'd soak the skins in vats of it. People in town would actually be asked, sometimes paid, to contribute their own urine to tanning vats because the ammonia helped break the hide down. There were jobs that basically amounted to collecting human waste as raw material for a different industry entirely. And because of that smell, tanneries, like gong farming, got pushed to the edges. Downwind, downstream, away from the walls if the town could manage it. There are records of entire neighborhoods existing because of where the tannery happened to sit. And you can still trace modern street layouts back to, this is where we put the smell. That's wild to me. A city's actual shape, the bones of it, partially decided by where people agreed to stash the thing they didn't want to smell. You walk those old streets today, if they still exist and haven't been paid over a dozen times, and the curve of the road might be a 500-year decision about a smell nobody remembers anymore. In fulling, cloth making, same DNA, different fabric. To full wool, to clean it and felt it and prep it for dye, workers would shred it underfoot in vats of stale urine. Because ammonia again, breaking down the lanolin and grease in the raw wool. So you've got fullers, tanners, and the cloth they're producing all running on the exact same resource. And someone in that economy was probably, literally, collecting chamber pots door to door because there was money in it. That's a story sitting in that alone. I mean, imagine it. A kid whose family's whole livelihood is going around collecting everyone's piss in buckets. And the shame of it, and the fact that without him, nobody in town has clothes. Imagine the scene where he falls for someone above his station and has to explain what he actually does for a living, and watch their face try and fail to stay neutral. What gets me about this whole cluster, gong farmer, tanner, fuller, is that they're all answering the same root question. Humans produce weight constantly, and clothing, shelter, and clean streets all require somebody to deal with what the body leaves behind. We just usually don't think about that as a story engine. We think of medieval life as castles and banners and a guy on a horse with a sword. Meanwhile, the actual machinery keeping that guy's clothes on his back involves vats of urine and a person standing in it for hours. The grand version we inherited edited out the parts that smell. And here's a thread I didn't expect to find, but I couldn't stop pulling once I noticed. These unclean trades weren't scattered randomly throughout medieval towns. They clustered. Tanners married into tanning families. Gong farming in a lot of places ran father to son, like an inheritance nobody else wanted, but everybody in that bloodline kept and just accepted as theirs. Same parish, same neighborhood, same handful of surnames showing up again and again in the records tied to the same unpleasant trade for generations. Which means there was an entire social world stacked underneath the one the town pretended to see. People who weren't invited to the respectable feast, but absolutely had their own in-jokes, their own version of pride that the rest of the town would never fully understand or want to. I think that's actually warmer than it sounds. Being shunned by everybody above you tends to make you tighter with those beside you. You could write a whole found family pocket living in the unclean quarter of a city. Gong farmers, tanners, fullers, all intermarried, all looked down on by the same merchants whose clothes they're the literal reason exist. And the emotional core isn't the smell at all. It's the warmth that grows specifically because the rest of the world won't come near. A community built entirely out of the thing everyone uses to reject them. And I want to flag something because I'm in this part of the thinking. Because it matters for how seriously to take some of the more theatrical details floating around online about all of this. A lot of the vivid stuff, the stuff that reads like horror set dressing and gets dramatically amplified later, especially by Victorian writers who had a genuine appetite for making the Dark Ages sound grim and gothic as possible for their readers. Well, the underlying jobs were real. The underlying unpleasantness was real. But some of the specific flourishes you see repeated, the exact wording of an insult hurled at a gong farmer, the certain dramatic death tolls, certain almost too perfect anecdotes, those got polished and exaggerated by people 2 or 3 centuries removed from the period, selling a version of medieval life that was scarier and filthier than documentation always supports cleanly. So, there's this layer of historical telephone going on, where reality gets unpleasant and gets described as unpleasant by the people living in it, which gets re-described centuries later by people who weren't even there and had every incentive to make it worse. For entertainment purposes, of course. And I'd rather hand you the honest version of that uncertainty than pretend that every gruesome detail and every weird job listicle is airtight. Because half the fun of digging into this stuff is learning to feel the difference between documented and grim and embellished for the gasp. Okay, pivot, because this next cluster isn't about the waste. It's about fear, and it hits different. Let's start with something obvious. Rat catchers. On the surface, obvious, of course. Rats, plague, get rid of the rats. But the part that actually stopped me was pondering what the job would actually feel like day to day. Not just the concept of it. Because you're not just catching one rat as a dramatic set piece. You're catching dozens, sometimes with terriers, sometimes with bare hands in a sack, every day for years, and at some point, handling a dead or dying rat stops being a moment and just becomes Tuesday. There's a callousing that has to happen to a person for that to become normal. And I think that callousing is the actual story more than the job is. Like, picture a kid apprenticed into this. First week, he flinches at everything. 6 months in, he's not flinching anymore, and that's not a triumph. Because that's a small grief nobody around him registers. Because to everyone else, he's just getting good at the job. Nobody throws him a party for the day he stopped feeling anything when a rat died in his hand. That's a quiet, specific kind of loss. Competence built directly out of a piece of you going numb. And it applies to about a dozen modern jobs too, which I'll come back to. Because it's not going anywhere. It's not a medieval problem. It's a people problem that medieval life just happened to make visible. And there's a status wrinkle here that I did not expect. Rat catching, depending on the era and place, actually edged toward respectable as a craft almost, especially once people started realizing the connection between rats and disease. Like, compare that to the gong farmer doing arguably more socially essential work and getting basically none of that respect. So even within the gross necessary jobs, there's a hierarchy. And the hierarchy doesn't track cleanly with how essential the work actually is. It just tracks with how visible and controllable the danger feels, because a rat you can see, chase, kill, win against. A cesspit is just omnipresent with a kill shot. With no kill shot, actually. And I think that's why one profession got a tiny bit of a glow to it and the other got nothing. The story you can tell yourself about winning matters more than what you're actually doing. There's also a genuinely great character sitting inside the town's relationship with the rat catcher. Because that relationship is inherently dishonest in a specific way. Everybody needs him. Nobody invites him to dinner. And if the rats ever stop being a problem, his usefulness evaporates overnight. You could write a rat catcher who's terrified of succeeding too completely, because his worth to the town and his welcome in the town are the same number. And if the rat population ever drops to 0, so does his reason to exist there. That's such an uncomfortable, specific kind of performance anxiety. And it's basically just creative freelance work, isn't it? Like the fear of being so good at solving the problem that you talk yourself out of the job. I didn't expect a 14th century pest controller to make me feel things about my own career, but here we are. Staying in the fear cluster for one more thing before we get to the next one, the big one, because this next one is almost as visceral as the rat catcher, and I think it gets slept on. Leech collectors. Bloodletting was, for a huge stretch of medieval and modern medicine, the go-to fix for nearly everything. Built on the idea that illness came from an imbalance in the body's four humors. And the fastest way to correct that imbalance was to get some drain some blood out, sorry. And the preferred tool for a lot of that draining, especially as it got more refined, was the leech. Which means somebody had to actually go get the leeches in bulk, constantly. And the way you got leeches before farming them became a thing was wading into ponds and bogs, bare-legged, on purpose, because the leeches would attach to exposed skin and you just pull them off and drop them in a jar. Picture that, like hours standing in cold, stagnant water, letting parasites latch onto you on purpose over and over, day after day, because that's the harvest. In a lot of regions, this work fell to poor women especially, who couldn't access steadier trades, wading into the same marshes year-round, sometimes with cattle blood smeared on their legs first to attract the leeches faster. Which, I'm sorry, but to be frank, that detail alone is the perfect horror film opening shot. A woman walking into still water at dawn, legs painted with blood, perfectly calm about it, because this is just a typical Tuesday for her. And the thing that wrecks me a little is how normal it would have had to become. Like, the first time every nerve in your body is screaming. The 100th? You're thinking about what you're making for dinner while a dozen leeches do their work on your shins. That's the same calcium I keep circling back to with the rat catcher. Except this one's much more intimate, because it's literally happening to her body repeatedly by choice, for income. The things we do. You could write a character who's been doing this so long that she stopped feeling the bite at all. And the moment that actually disturbs her isn't the leeches anymore. It's realizing midway that she genuinely can't remember the last time something hurt her the way it was supposed to. That's not a gross out scene. That's just a quiet little tragedy about what happens when a body adapts to things that has no other choice to do too. There's also a sharp little irony right next to the plague doctor's wrong but sincere mask. Bloodletting. The whole reason this profession existed at all was built on medicine that was just incorrect. Like, draining a sick person's blood usually didn't help and often actively weakened them further. So, you have an entire trade, an entire population of women standing in marshes, risking infection and blood loss themselves, built in service of a treatment that fundamentally, more often than not, was making patients worse, not better. Nobody involved knew that. Everybody involved was doing their genuine best with what they believed to be true. That's the same shape as the Sin Eater, isn't it? Sincere effort real cost applied toward a problem that the effort never actually solved. And I'll get to the Sin Eater here in a minute. And this is one of those traits that answer a question I keep circling back to. What happened to the jobs once the underlying problem got solved, or at least understood differently? Well, leech collecting by hand mostly died out for two reasons. The wild leech population in a lot of well-harvested areas just collapsed from over-harvesting, and medicine slowly, painfully, moved away from bloodletting as the answer to everything. So, it's a profession that vanished partly because it worked itself out of existence by consuming its own resource, and partially because the science underneath it finally got corrected. Eventually, leeches got farmed instead of gathered wild, which is its own quieter version of the same job. Industrialized into something a lot less marsh and a lot less blood-smeared calm. There's a story in that handoff, too. An old collector watching a younger generation buy leeches from a farm supplier instead of waiting for them, and not knowing whether to feel relieved that nobody has to stand in that cold water anymore, or strangely robbed of the one skill she ever had that made her indispensable to the world. Now, plague doctors. And I have to be straight with you about something before I get into the fun part, because the honest version of this is actually more interesting than the myth. So the image that everybody has once I say plague doctors of the, long black coat, wide brim hat, that bird-like mask with the long curved beak stuffed with herbs and flowers, well, that iconic look is not medieval, mostly. It comes later, generally credited to a French physician designing protective gear for plague doctors in the 1600s, well after the worst of the Black Death. So the thing that looks like most medieval horror movie out of this entire list is actually closer to early modern. The record's a little fuzzy on exactly what and how spread the costume really was versus how iconic it became after the fact. And I'd rather tell you that honestly than pretend I have it nailed down to the exact year and date, because that's the exact kind of detail that gets flattened by repetition until everyone assumes it was just always like that. But here's what actually doesn't deflate the story. If anything, it sharpens it because it means the beak mask wasn't decoration. It was genuine. If scientifically wrong, an attempt at a gas mask. I mean, think about it. Okay, so the thinking at the time was that disease traveled through bad air. So the beak was packed with strong-smelling herbs and dried flowers to filter the air before it reached the doctor. Wrong science, but completely real fear. A real attempt to solve an unsolvable problem with the tools available at the time. That's such a precise emotional snapshot, isn't it? Like a person doing everything they know how to do, fully committed while still fundamentally being powerless against what they're facing. You could write a character who knows deep down that the mask probably isn't working, but puts it on every single morning anyway, because the alternative is walking into a dying patient's home with literally nothing between him and the thing he's most afraid of. See, the mask isn't protection. It's a ritual that makes terror survivable enough to keep showing up. And plague doctors occupied this bizarre dual role. Sometimes hired directly by towns, paid a salary specifically to treat the sick regardless of ability to pay, because cities needed someone willing to go into the houses everyone else was boarding up. So, in a weird way, they were the most official, institutionally backed person on this entire list. And also the most visually terrifying person a sick household could see walking up the path. Like, imagine being a child in a plague year, and the sound of those boots outside means someone in your house is dying. The plague doctor isn't the disease, but to a kid, in that moment, he may as well be the shape the disease takes when it finally comes for your family. There is a whole story in a character who grows up associating a specific silhouette with the worst day of their life and decides later, or decades later, sees that same silhouette and has a full body reaction before their brain even catches up. And the part I didn't expect, the part that quietly recontextualized the whole role for me, is that being officially employed by a town didn't make the doctor safe from the town's fear of him. Like in some places, the contracts these doctors signed came with real restrictions baked in. Limits on who they could treat without permission. Expectations on how and where they could move throughout the town. Sometimes a kind of informal quarantine wrapped around their daily life. Because the man whose entire job was to walk into infected houses was also, obviously, the man most likely carrying something out of them. So, you've got someone hired specifically because the town needs a barrier between itself and death, who then has to live as a barrier that the town builds around him. He is protecting them and being protected against in the same role. At the same time, and I don't think those two things ever stopped pulling against each other for the entire length of the career. Like, picture him going home at night to a family that loves him but is also quietly watching him a little too closely for the first cough, the first fever, the first sign that he spends all day fighting that thing, well, finally comes home with him. That's not a villain's loneliness. That's much sadder, much more ordinary kind. Excuse me. Being feared by the exact people who need you the most, every single night for years. Sorry guys, give me a second. Okay. Where was I? Oh, yes. And never quite getting to put that fear down. Sin Eater's next. Finally, I know. And this one sits with me differently than the others. Quieter, heavier actually. The role, where and when it was practiced, genuinely worked like this. When someone died, anybody died, a Sin Eater would be brought in. Food and drink passed over or placed on the body, and the Sin Eater would eat and drink it, symbolically taking on the sins of the dead so their soul could pass on unburdened. I want to flag that, honestly, because that documentation on exactly how widespread this was and how formalized the ritual actually got, well, it's thinner than I'd like. A lot of what survives comes from scattered local accounts rather than one clean, unbroken tradition. And there are stories of specific individuals doing this informally into the early 20th century in parts of rural Britain, which is an insane thing to sit with. Just saying. Britain, what's up? Anyway, so this isn't some ancient history. This overlaps with photographs and living memory and people whose grandparents could have witnessed it. And think about what that role does to a person socially. You are, by the entire logic of the ritual, accumulating other people's sin. Every funeral adds to that pile. Nobody wants to be close to you. Not because you did anything wrong, but because of what you're holding. You then become kind of a spiritual landfill, if you will, for an entire community, one funeral at a time. And the more people you help, the more you're avoided, which is like the gong farmer's tension, the rat catcher's tension, just dressed up in completely different clothes. Necessary and isolating. The exact thing that makes you useful is the exact thing that makes you untouchable. There's a story I can't stop thinking about that lives inside this. Like a sin eater nearing the end of their own life, having spent decades absorbing everyone else's wrongdoing, symbolically or not, and wondering who is going to eat theirs. Like, is there a sin eater for the sin eater? Does the ritual even apply to him, or does he die the one person in the village nobody's willing to take the weight off of his hands with? Because everyone's too afraid of how much might already be in there. That's not a plot twist. That's just sitting with the implication of the role taken seriously. And it's devastating once you actually let yourself feel it instead of just filing it under interesting medieval trivia. And I think that's the real hinge of this whole topic, the whole thing underneath it. A sin eater can't actually guarantee anyone's soul gets cleared. A plague doctor's mask probably wasn't doing much. A rat catcher can't promise the plague won't come anyway. None of these jobs worked in the sense of actually solving the underlying fear. What they did was give a frightened community something to point at. A person, a ritual, a role, so the fear had somewhere to go besides sitting there raw and unmanaged. These were coping mechanisms with titles. And that reframes the entire topic for me. It's not just look how weird people used to be. It's look how hard people have always worked to build a structure around things that they have no control over. We still do this. We just don't call it sin eating. And there's a cousin profession to the sin eater that I think deserves a beat of its own because it flips the emotional logic in a way that's almost the opposite problem. The professional mourner. Hired weeping, hired wailing, hired grief, present in funeral customs across a huge stretch of history and geography, including plenty of medieval contexts where a family with means would bring in mourners specifically to perform visible, audible sorrow at a funeral because a quiet funeral could read as disrespect to the dead, or worse, a sign the deceased wasn't loved enough to be properly grieved. So, the more dramatic the wailing, the more the family status and devotion got communicated to everyone watching. Grief weaponized as performance, and performance treated as proof of love. And the part that catches me, makes me wonder, is the skill of it. Like, a good professional mourner has to produce something that reads as real. Like the right pitch of a wail, the right collapse at the right moment, tears that look like grief and not acting, while feeling, underneath all of it, absolutely nothing personal toward that person in the coffin. That's not that different from what an actor does, except an actor's audience knows it's a performance, and a mourner's audience is specifically not supposed to clock the difference. You could write a story about a mourner who's so good at this that she starts to lose track of herself, mid-well, of where the performance ends, and something genuinely raw starts leaking in. Not for this particular stranger in the particular coffin, but for every funeral that came before this one. Every grief she's faked so convincingly that her body's stopped distinguishing real from rehearsed. That's a quietly horrifying character study. A person, a woman, who cries perfectly, professionally, beautifully even, for people she's never met, and hasn't let herself cry once. For real. For the people she actually loved, because she doesn't trust herself to know the difference anymore. And there's also, if you noticed, a little class wrinkle sitting in the heart of it. Only families with enough money could afford hired grief. Which means the volume and theater of a funeral often had nothing to do with how loved the dead person actually was, and everything to do with what the surviving family could pay for. Imagine the quietly furious thought of a poor widow standing at the edge of a wealthy neighbor's wildly theatrical funeral, watching strangers paid to wail louder for a man they never knew than anyone managed to cry, genuinely, for her own husband, buried 2 winters ago with nothing but unwitnessed, unrewarded, but real tears. That's the kind of detail that turns this into a word custom to an actual ache. And I think that's exactly the line this whole topic keeps walking. Interesting on the surface, but devastating about 4 seconds after you actually sit with it. And a quick gear shift, because I want to bring in one more profession that's not anything about filth or death at all. And the contrast matters, I promise. The herald. Like, heralds carried messages between powerful people, announced news, sometimes negotiated terms during conflicts, and existed under a kind of protected status, if you will, because killing a herald was its own specific violation, separate from whatever conflict was actually happening, which is fascinating because it means a herald's body was a tool of information, if you will, like deliberately made safer than an ordinary person's, specifically so that messages could keep flowing evenly between two people actively trying to kill each other. But, as we know, protection on paper is not the same as protection in practice. And that gap is an entire story waiting to be heard. Like, what happens to a herald who shows up with news nobody wants to hear? What happens the one time the protected status gets tested by someone who decides the rules don't apply to them today? You could write a herald who has delivered hundreds of messages without incident, completely confident in the shield his role provides. And one specific message, maybe a refusal or a confession or just bad timing, turns out to be the one where the shield doesn't hold. That right there. That's a character who's built his entire sense of safety on a social contract, finding out in real time that social contracts only work as long as everyone agrees to keep believing in them. And then there's a sneakier story version-wise of that same tension, though. Imagine it. A herald starts editing the messages he carries, softening a threat, sharpening a compliment, quietly altering the temperature of what's being said because he's the only one who knows both rooms. The room the message came from and the room it's arriving to. And he's the only one who can see how badly it's about to land. He's not supposed to have an opinion. He's a conduit, but conduits are still people, and people have opinions. And at some point, that gap between deliver the message exactly and deliver the message that doesn't get someone killed becomes an entire plot. See, that's a story about power without authority. Total access to the most important information in the kingdom and no actual say in any of it. Except for that one quiet, dangerous moment where he decides to take some anyway. Now, I've got that herald sitting next to the gong farmer in my head. I can't stop comparing them because they are on the complete opposite ends of a hierarchy that doesn't track the way you'd expect. The herald is dangerous work, like honestly, physically dangerous, walking straight into hostile camps, carrying words that might get him killed. And he gets status for it, like robes, recognition, a name people remember. And the gong farmer does work that's arguably more essential to daily survival, with real physical risk of his own, and gets none of it. Same root ingredient, a job built around real danger, and the surface of a whole community, and one gets honored while the other gets paid and shunned in the same transaction. I don't think that's about how necessary the work actually is. I think it's about which fears a society is willing to look at directly. War, politics, power, those are fears a medieval town could admit to having out loud, with pageantry even. But filth, disease, and death, these are fears nobody wanted to admit to feeling. So the people managing them quietly got erased from the respectable version instead of celebrating for handling it. The rat catcher lands somewhere in the uncomfortable middle of that scale. And it's not a coincidence either. Pest control sits right at the exact point where fear becomes nameable enough to admit to, and yet not glamorous enough to reward properly. Like, you can chart practically every job on this list along that same line. And it's not, how hard is this work? It's, okay, how okay is this town with admitting it's scared? And some of these traits didn't fade out. They just evolved straight into jobs that still exist to this day, which I find oddly comforting in a way I didn't expect. Like, the tanner is still here, minus the urine vats, thank God. Modern leatherworking exists because that trade never stopped. It just got chemistry. The fuller's job didn't disappear either. It just splintered into industrial textile processing, and more directly, the entire profession of dry cleaning. Still solving the exact same problem: getting grease and grime out of fabrics people need to wear in public. Just nobody's standing in a vat of pee doing it with their feet. Again, thank God. The herald's lineage runs pretty cleanly into modern diplomatic couriers and, if we're being honest, press secretaries. Like, people who, well, somebody still has to be the person standing between the two rooms that don't trust each other, translating the temperature of a message so it doesn't land a war. And that job never went away. It just changed the wardrobe. Even the rat catcher has a living descendant, walking around in a van in a license called an exterminator, doing fundamentally the same job but with better tools and better public relations. But notice which ones didn't make that transition. The sin eater, the professional mourner, mostly outside a small handful of cultural pockets where hired grief still quietly persists. The leech collector. Those didn't evolve into a modern equivalent because the underlying belief system underneath collapsed. Not the underlying problem. We still have plenty of waste, plenty of pests, and plenty of diseases to manage, but the thing is the problems never left, so the jobs modernized alongside the problems. But we stopped believing, collectively and structurally, that a stranger eating bread over a corpse could move sin out of a dying soul. The job didn't get replaced with a better version. It just stopped making sense. The moment the belief underneath it stopped being load-bearing. That's such a different kind of extinction than we invented a machine that does this now. That's a job dying because the worldview it was standing on quietly gave out from under it. And I think that's the most haunting category on this entire list. The professions that didn't get obsoleted by technology, just by what people stopped letting themselves believe. Here's the thing that's sitting underneath this entire video. What I keep almost saying and then, following a different thread instead. Every one of these professions is just a fossil. A career-shaped imprint of a fear or need that got common enough, persistent enough that an entire role was formed around managing it. Waste, death, disease, information. Strip away the costumes and the rituals, and what you're looking at is the town's nervous system. Externalized, walking around in specific clothes, doing specific jobs, so the fear doesn't have to live out inside every single resident individually. You outsource the dread to a role. That's what a profession like this actually is. And once you see it that way, you start seeing modern versions everywhere. But actually, hold on. Let me flip this for a second, because the funnier direction is just as telling. I promise. See, if our gong farmer got yanked 700 years forward and somebody tried to explain our jobs to him, I genuinely think half the time they think it would be a fever dream to him. The guy who spends his nights climbing into cesspits. There is a job where you get paid to play games for a camera. There's a job where you taste different versions of the same cracker all day and write down adjectives. He'd probably nod politely and then go ask someone normal what's actually going on. And honestly, fair. Far from inside our own centuries, these jobs feel completely unremarkable. Somebody's got to do it. The market wanted it, and here we are. That's the exact flatness with which a 14th century apprentice clocked in at the cesspit. Weird only exists from the outside. Nobody clocks into their normal and thinks, wow, this is strange. They just think, this is Tuesday. Cool. Same as the gong farmer, the leech collector wading into the cold water at dawn without flinching anymore. That's sort of the whole engine of this whole video. Honestly, like the jobs that look the most bizarre to us were never bizarre to the people doing them. We're just standing far enough away to finally see the shape. Okay, but the uncomfortable modern versions of this, like the ones that actually map into the heavier stuff instead of the funny stuff, those are the ones I can't stop thinking about. And this is where it gets a little uncomfortable, not gonna lie. Content moderators, like the people who sit and absorb the absolute worst material the internet produces all day, every day, so the rest of us never have to see it. That is a modern day sin eater. And it's not a metaphor I'm stretching for effect, it's just structurally the same job. Like someone voluntarily exposed to something corrosive on behalf of a community that mostly doesn't think about them. So everyone else's feed stays clean. Crime scene cleaners, sanitation workers to this day, still doing essential work that most people actively avoid thinking about. And they have the same social invisibility the gong farmer had, just with trucks instead of buckets. Cybersecurity analysts stare at attack logs and breach attempts all night, managing a fear most people don't even know how to be afraid of correctly. The same way, nobody in a plague year fully understood what they were actually facing either. Just that something invisible was coming for them and somebody needed to stand between it and the door. And I don't think that comparison is a cute callback. It's the point. Like, we didn't get less afraid as a species. We got better at hiding the jobs that manage the fear, tucking them into server rooms and night shifts and content QAs, and instead of putting a guy in a beaked mask walking down the street where you can see him coming. The medieval version is just more honest, actually. I mean, at least you can see the plague doctor coming, right? Like, you knew exactly what role he played and what he represented. Our equivalents are invisible by design. And I'm not sure that's actually progress so much as it's a different kind of editing the same thing out of the grand narrative. Same as we did with the kings and castles version of medieval history. We're doing it again in real time to our own century, and most of us don't even notice. And honestly, the content moderator parallel is the one I can't let go of because it maps too cleanly into the sin eater for comfort. Like, just picture somebody 3 years into that job. First month, everything she reviews follows her home. She can't eat dinner without some image from the queue surfacing behind her eyes uninvited. By year 3, she's numb to most of it. That same numbness the rat catcher and leech collector both grew into. Except her numbness is happening to a less visible part of her body. It's happening to the part of her that, well, used to react to horror at all. Nobody throws a party for her getting good at her job. her partner doesn't really know what she looks at all day because she stopped trying to explain it, because explaining it just exports the weight onto someone she loves. And she spent this entire career absorbing weight specifically so other people don't have to carry it. You could write her exactly like a sin eater who never got the ritual, never got the ceremony, and never got the village gathering around to acknowledge what she's taking on. Just a chair, a screen, and a cue that refills the second she turns it on and clears it. In a society that benefits constantly from what she's doing while collectively agreeing not to think about her. That's not a metaphor stretched to fit. That's the same job. We just took the mask off and gave her a badge and login instead. And that's the part I can't quite put down. If somebody 700 years from now goes looking for the fossils of our fears the way I just went looking for theirs, what's the job that's going to sound completely made up to them? What's our gong farmer? Our sin eater? Someone whose entire occupation is staring into a queue of the worst things humans produce so the rest of us never have to. Someone who exists to specifically absorb a fear so common, so structural that an entire career quietly formed around it and nobody talks about what it costs the person doing it. And I generally don't know what that job is yet. I think right now we're too close to see the shape of it clearly. The same way nobody in 1325 thought gong farmer sounded strange. It was just an occupation, just Tuesday. It was the job. It was how the city worked. Weird is a thing that only shows up with distance. Anyway, that's where my brain's at with all of this. I haven't actually written anything off yet. This is just all live wiring in my mind, but the gong farmer thing especially won't let me go. That image of a guy walking home in the dark of night, right as the rest of the town is waking up. 2 completely different days brushing past each other on the same street. I keep wanting to know what he thinks about going on those walks. Anyway, if you have thoughts or if you already know which one you're stealing first, drop it in the comments. I'm curious. I bet some of you are already halfway through one of those stories right now. I get it. Several of them have teeth. That's the thing though. Every weird job is just somebody's unresolved fear wearing a uniform. Anyway, if this made you think, like the video. Subscribe if you want more stuff like this. This is WriteSparky, and I'll see you in the next video.